Buenos días y bienvenidos a esta cuarta edición de la iniciativa que organizamos conjuntamente Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturi, como siempre, para crear un espacio de reflexión alrededor de las sendas geopolíticas de la transición energética desde distintos ángulos. En esta ocasión nos queremos focalizar en el análisis, en la conversación sobre las políticas industriales y comerciales y cómo estas pueden afectar a la transición energética en áreas tan relevantes como Estados Unidos, China y la Unión Europea. Y cómo, de alguna manera, eso va a hacer que estas áreas se posicionen en este proceso de transición energética. Para la apertura de esta sesión, que celebramos, como siempre, en un formato híbrido y que tenemos más de 800 personas registradas para asistir en el formato híbrido online y presencial, tenemos la fortuna de contar con Charles Powell, director del Instituto Elcano, y con María Eugenia Coronado, directora general de Fundación Naturi, a quien cedo ya la palabra.
Gracias, Manuel. Pues buenos días, bienvenidos y muchas gracias por su asistencia e interés tanto a las personas que están aquí acompañándonos en el auditorio como a quienes se han conectado para seguir esta sesión que cumple ya 4 años de actividad y que ha hecho un recorrido importante por temas que en el ámbito geoestratégico tienen muchísima relevancia y también muchísimo interés. Con una audiencia tan grande como la que comentaba Manuel, yo me quiero permitir un par de minutos para contarles que nuestra fundación dedica una parte muy importante de su actividad a temas de carácter social, abanderados de alguna manera por 2 programas que son muy valiosos para nosotros. El primero, el plan de vulnerabilidad, con el que buscamos llegar a las familias que se encuentran en situación de pobreza energética para ayudarles a través de la rehabilitación energética y también de asesoría a estas familias para mejorar la eficiencia energética de sus viviendas, su confort y también para generar un ahorro energético en su consumo, un ahorro que para ellas es realmente muy importante. Segundo, tenemos un programa focalizado en generar conocimiento en el sector energético desde edades muy tempranas, un programa que además promueve la inclusión, que promueve las vocaciones tecnológicas y que también con mucho énfasis está impulsando la formación profesional en empleos verdes para facilitar la incorporación al mercado laboral de los jóvenes y evitar el abandono escolar, que es muy importante en nuestro país, y también para facilitar la empleabilidad de las personas, también personas vulnerables. Esta labor social la complementamos con otra línea de actuación que desde nuestra óptica es también necesaria y muy importante, y es la de generar espacios para la reflexión, para el análisis informado y en profundidad, siempre apoyado de la mano de expertos como los que nos van a acompañar en la sesión de hoy, para debatir sobre los grandes temas que afectan al sector energético en el presente y que lo afectarán en el futuro. Esta tarea la desarrollamos a través de estudios, análisis, informes, notas, conferencias y foros como el que nos convoca hoy, y que celebramos gracias a una alianza que para nosotros es muy valiosa y es la colaboración que tenemos con el Real Instituto Elcano. Su experiencia, su conocimiento, su visión estratégica sobre muchos temas son para nosotros una garantía del interés, de la calidad y del contenido de estos encuentros, así que para nosotros realmente es muy importante haber mantenido en el tiempo esta iniciativa. Sin duda, esta actividad y este foro que vamos a tener el día de hoy, con una visión geoestratégica, nos permite de alguna manera ampliar el foco y la perspectiva de análisis en un momento geopolítico que es particularmente complejo, con tensiones crecientes dentro de un sector que también es muy complejo y que se encuentra inmerso en un proceso de transición, de transformación tecnológica, con grandes retos y con grandes objetivos por cumplir, que además son de muchísima envergadura. Así que el tema de esta sesión pues no podía ser más relevante y más oportuno. Las políticas industriales y comerciales están redefiniendo las cadenas de valor global y con ello el equilibrio entre la transición energética y la competitividad industrial en muchísimas regiones del mundo. Hoy nos proponemos analizar cómo están respondiendo en este escenario 3 grandes economías como son China, la Unión Europea y Estados Unidos. Y tenemos para ello el privilegio de contar con ponentes con muchísima experiencia, muchísimo conocimiento, empezando con Nicolás González Casares, que compartirá con nosotros la visión de la Unión Europea. Su experiencia como diputado y eurodiputado y miembro activo de la Comisión de Industria, Investigación y Energía del Parlamento Europeo, pues lo sitúa en una posición realmente clave y privilegiada para que nos dé un poco de luces antes de entrar en el debate que tendremos posteriormente. Yo quiero agradecer muy especialmente su participación, agradecer la participación de los ponentes que nos acompañan hoy. Gracias de nuevo a Gonzalo, quien, como es habitual, actuará como moderador con su conocimiento también muy informado y muy potente en estas materias. Y por último, ya nada más, agradecer de nuevo al Real Instituto Elcano, en cabeza de su director general, Charles Powell, que está hoy con nosotros, por su apoyo continuado a esta iniciativa que tenemos la voluntad de seguir impulsando para promover, como lo hemos hecho hasta ahora, un conocimiento global y transversal sobre el sector energético y sobre la industria. Así que nada más, espero que la sesión sea de todo su interés y muchísimas gracias. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, María Eugenia. Efectivamente, yo creo que tenemos para muchos años, teniendo en cuenta cómo la geopolítica va conformándose de manera variable, ¿no? cada año. Cedo la palabra ahora a Charles Powell, director de Real Instituto Elcano, coorganizador con Fundación de esta iniciativa.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Muchas gracias, Manuel. Muchas gracias, Eugenia. Para el Real Instituto Elcano es un honor y un placer compartir una vez más esta jornada con la Fundación Naturgy, miembro de nuestro patronato. Y antes de empezar, quiero enviarles un saludo muy cordial de nuestro presidente, José Juan Ruiz, que se encuentra hoy en Toledo con Felipe González y con Aníbal Cavaco Silva, conmemorando el 40 aniversario de la adhesión de España y de Portugal a las comunidades europeas. Muchas gracias también a Gonzalo Escribano y a todo el equipo Elcano por haber contribuido a la organización de este acto. Yo quisiera compartir con ustedes un par de reflexiones muy rápidas. Los ponentes que hablarán a continuación desarrollarán estos temas mucho mejor de lo que yo pudiera hacer, pero creo que puede ser interesante intentar enmarcar esta conversación que vamos a tener hoy con algunos comentarios previos. En primer lugar, sobre el orden internacional en el que nos encontramos. Como saben ustedes, es un orden internacional caracterizado por la rivalidad sistémica y que probablemente dominará todo el siglo entre Estados Unidos y China, pero no es un orden bipolar clásico. Más bien, estamos ante un orden multipolar, quizás con tendencia bipolar, pero en todo caso parece innegable que hay otros polos, otras grandes potencias y también potencias emergentes que no podemos perder de vista, sobre todo porque aproximadamente el 60% de los países miembros de Naciones Unidas, si observamos sus votaciones en la Asamblea General, detectamos que no se alinean de una forma clara ni con China ni con Estados Unidos. Es decir, hay aproximadamente un 60% de estados que son, digamos, se pueden caracterizar como transaccionales o practican eso que ahora llamamos strategic hedging. Yo acabo de estar una semana en Kazajstán y me ha fascinado conocer este país, nunca había estado allí. Y gracias precisamente a sus fuerzas energéticas, Kazajstán creo que se está convirtiendo en un ejemplo claro de una potencia media, una economía emergente que está aprendiendo con enorme habilidad y con enorme éxito a navegar estas aguas turbulentas en las que estamos. Tiene buenas relaciones con China, con Rusia, pero también con Estados Unidos y con la Unión Europea. Por lo tanto, tenemos una rivalidad sistémica sino-americana, pero en un orden multipolar y lamentablemente en un contexto también de organizaciones y organismos multilaterales en crisis, tanto las políticas, el sistema de Naciones Unidas, como las económicas, el sistema, por ejemplo, la Organización Mundial de Comercio, las instituciones de Bretton Woods. Y esto está dando lugar al auge de un fenómeno que empezamos a denominar ya como el minilateralismo. Por ejemplo, en el propio Kazajstán, Kazajstán lidera una asociación de países de Asia Central que empieza a ser un actor relevante. Lo que quiero subrayar ahora, sobre todo, es que este es un entorno muy difícil para un ente, un organismo tan complejo como la Unión Europea, que además nos plantea preguntas de fondo sobre nuestra propia identidad y sobre nuestros objetivos. ¿Qué es la Unión Europea en realidad? Somos básicamente un mercado interior de 450 millones de personas, pero un mercado interior, por cierto, incompleto y, como dice algún autor, agujereado como un queso de Gruyère, porque muchas de nuestras políticas ya no son no están tan cohesionadas como lo estuvieron. Estamos muy lejos de ser una unión política, no somos, por supuesto, una unión energética, y esto es muy relevante para la conversación de hoy. También sabemos que somos incapaces ni siquiera de garantizar nuestra integridad territorial sin acudir a la OTAN, y eso a pesar de que gastamos aproximadamente 300.000 billones de euros al año en defensa. No gastamos poco, simplemente gastamos mal. ¿Qué somos entonces? Muchos de nosotros seguimos pensando que la Unión debería considerarse una potencia normativa, es decir, una potencia capaz de moldear las normas internacionales que rigen el sistema global. El problema es que muchas de estas normas están siendo cuestionadas tanto por Estados Unidos, sorprendentemente quizás, como sobre todo por China y, por supuesto, por Rusia. ¿Cuál es la respuesta europea a estos retos? En primer lugar, esto que venimos denominando la autonomía estratégica, que yo defino de una manera muy simple. La autonomía estratégica es nuestra capacidad para defender nuestros valores e intereses sin pedir permiso ni ayuda a terceros. Esta es la principal, creo, apuesta de la Unión en estos momentos. Nuestra segunda apuesta debería ser completar el mercado interior, que, como digo, adolece de grandes problemas, por ejemplo, en el ámbito de la energía, pero también, sobre todo, en el ámbito de la productividad, quizás más que de la competitividad, implementando los famosos informes de Draghi y de Letta. Y en tercer lugar, y esto quizás es algo que no se menciona suficientemente, deberíamos cuidar mucho más nuestra cohesión política y nuestra cohesión social internas frente a los populismos que están haciendo estragos en muchos de nuestros países. La Unión se enfrenta, geopolíticamente hablando, a 4 grandes retos principales, en mi opinión. El primero, obviamente, se llama Rusia. Desde su brutal, ilegal y absolutamente injustificada invasión de Ucrania, Rusia se ha convertido en una amenaza existencial para todos nosotros, aunque quienes estamos en esta esquina de Europa quizás no siempre lo percibamos con claridad. Parece evidente que Vladimir Putin no quiere la paz en Ucrania y, por lo tanto, la Unión Europea debe mantenerse firme en las políticas que ha venido desarrollando hasta la fecha. En primer lugar, garantizando el total desacoplamiento energético de Rusia, y no solo energético, sino incluso físico, como han hecho los países bálticos en el mes de febrero, desconectando su red eléctrica de la red eléctrica rusa. Y, por supuesto, los demás Estados miembros debemos seguir aplicando las sanciones que, a pesar de las dificultades que todos conocemos, empiezan a tener un efecto importante. En otras palabras, la invasión de Ucrania por parte de Rusia nos obliga y nos anima y nos da un magnífico pretexto para profundizar en nuestra autonomía estratégica energética. Esto nos requerirá diversificar nuestras relaciones con terceros, manteniendo una buena relación con socios tradicionales como Noruega, Nigeria, los países del Golfo, etcétera, pero también debemos buscar nuevas alternativas. La segunda gran preocupación de la Unión, increíblemente en estos momentos, es la administración Trump. ¿Quién nos iba a decir, a quienes nos consideramos atlantistas de toda la vida, que estaríamos hablando ahora también no de desacoplarnos de Estados Unidos, pero sí de de-risking, de reducir los riesgos que plantea y que conlleva la relación con Estados Unidos? Recordarán ustedes quizás, una periodista americana hace años dijo que muchos, cuando contemplan el fenómeno Trump, algunos se lo toman literalmente pero no en serio, otros se lo toman en serio pero no literalmente. Pues bien, señoras y señores, creo que ha llegado el momento de tomarlo en serio y literalmente. Trump también representa una amenaza para la propia Unión Europea y, por lo tanto, debemos mantenernos firmes mediante una política arancelaria y comercial robusta, mediante los esfuerzos que debamos acometer por resistir sus intentos de debilitar la Unión Europea, fomentando la desunión y los conflictos internos, rechazando sus esfuerzos por ingerir e interferir políticamente en nuestros Estados miembros, como viene haciendo, y llevando a cabo un de-risking selectivo. Y en este sentido, obviamente, tenemos que tener mucho cuidado con la excesiva dependencia del gas natural licuado de procedencia estadounidense. La tercera amenaza es China. Y aquí quiero subrayar que la Unión Europea padece una cierta esquizofrenia en sus relaciones con China. Hace ya años, la Unión definió una política hacia China basada en 3 ejes, definiendo a China como un socio, por ejemplo, en la lucha contra el cambio climático, un competidor en el ámbito comercial y un rival sistémico, por considerar que China no comparte nuestras normas. Precisamente si somos una potencia normativa, es un problema serio que China pretenda cuestionar las normas que realmente caracterizan a la Unión. Pero en este sentido debemos tener cuidado. El hecho de que la administración Trump se haya convertido en una fuerza básicamente hostil y, por supuesto, imprevisible, no significa que debamos echarnos en brazos de China. La Unión Europea debe seguir planteando una respuesta de nuevo robusta a las agresivas políticas arancelarias, comerciales e industriales de China. Tenemos que protegernos ante fenómenos como el intento de inundar los mercados europeos con baterías y vehículos eléctricos por parte de China y procurar también, en la medida de lo posible, diversificar las cadenas de suministro. Y por último, quiero mencionar brevemente una cuarta amenaza, un cuarto problema al que se enfrenta la Unión, un cuarto reto, que es nuestra relación con el llamado sur plural. Nosotros en Elcano lo llamamos sur plural, nos preferimos esa expresión a la que se suele utilizarse, que es el sur global. Los europeos, en mi opinión, tenemos cierto complejo de culpa en relación con los grandes principios y las estructuras que rigen el orden liberal internacional. No estamos solos, y esto es algo que debemos recordar con frecuencia. No somos los únicos que queremos un orden liberal basado en reglas previsibles y predecibles. Esto es algo que he podido constatar, como decía también antes, personalmente en Kazajstán. Muchos estados menores, más pequeños, vulnerables, pero con economías emergentes potentes, están también pendientes de que Europa les ofrezca su liderazgo. Y por lo tanto, creo que la gran aportación que puede hacer la Unión Europea a la situación difícil internacional que atravesamos es precisamente intentar liderar la reforma del orden liberal internacional para hacerlo más equitativo y más inclusivo. Espero que estos temas surjan, estoy seguro de que surgirán a lo largo del coloquio de hoy, y les deseo a todos una jornada muy fructífera. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, María Eugenia y Charles. La verdad es que una realidad bien compleja, ¿no? Y esperamos tener un debate bien interesante alrededor de todo esto. Bueno, para empezar la sesión tenemos la fortuna de contar hoy con nosotros con Nicolás González Casares. Como se ha dicho, Nicolás, eurodiputado y miembro de la Comisión de Industria, Investigación y Energía, el ITRE del Parlamento Europeo, donde las políticas de transición justa, Pacto Verde Europeo, energías limpias y diseño del mercado eléctrico han estado en el foco de su actividad y lo siguen estando y lo estarán, seguro. Muchas gracias, Nicolás, por aceptar esta invitación por parte del Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturgy, y te cedo la palabra.
Bueno, muchas gracias y muchas gracias por las introducciones. Yo no sé qué voy a hacer después de tan magistrales palabras, porque me va a costar llegar a ese nivel, gracias a la Fundación Naturgy y al Instituto Elcano, Charles, María Eugenia, por esta introducción que, ya digo, me pone el listón muy elevado, ¿no? Bien, gracias también por organizar jornadas como esta, que yo creo que son muy importantes, y gracias también a los asistentes, los que están aquí hoy, a los que están online, que parece ser que son muchos, ¿no? Cada vez es más evidente que las discusiones energéticas no pueden desvincularse de su dimensión política, una dimensión que siempre ha estado presente, pero creo que hoy, en este momento de transición energética que vivimos y ecológica, pues lo vemos con mayor intensidad. Vivimos tiempos convulsos, marcados con algo que está de fondo, que es la crisis climática. Es decir, no podemos olvidarnos que más allá de estas vicisitudes geopolíticas que estamos teniendo, el planeta se está calentando. Y yo quiero recordar hace unos días, cuando murió falleció el presidente Mújica de Uruguay, en un editorial de la SER, Aimar Breto recordó pues, una fábula latinoamericana del colibrí y el jaguar, ¿no? Que es el colibrí que en su pico lleva agua para apagar un incendio en la selva y va pasando y el jaguar lo ve pasar y dice: ¿pero qué hace este colibrí? ¿Qué haces, colibrí? Tú no vas a poder apagar ese fuego. Entonces Aimar recordaba a Mújica diciendo: yo estoy haciendo mi parte, yo estoy cumpliendo con mi parte. Y yo creo que en políticas de clima y de transición ecológica, Europa está tratando de poner su parte. Es muy criticada por esto, lo es, pero está haciendo sus deberes con el interés fundamental de reducir nuestra huella climática, de trabajar para que el planeta sea más habitable en el medio y largo plazo, para cumplir, y esto es muy importante, con nuestros compromisos multilaterales, con el Acuerdo de París, que sigue siendo un marco de encuentro para la multilateralidad a pesar de Estados Unidos, y fundamentalmente también por un interés propio, porque también ahí, en esa lucha, en ese camino que estamos avanzando, hay un interés propio, y es que sabemos y conocemos perfectamente, como europeos, que las consecuencias económicas de una dependencia casi a perpetuidad de los hidrocarburos importados, pues nos pone en peligro, desde las crisis históricas del petróleo hasta la nueva mencionada con Rusia, donde evidentemente el trasfondo de nuestra dependencia fósil de Rusia está en el origen de muchos de los problemas que estamos viviendo hoy los europeos, incluidos aquellos de seguridad. Pero claro, la solución no es cambiar gas o un combustible fósil a alguien que le compramos y hacernos dependientes de otros, es decir, la sustitución de gas ruso por el de una administración como la estadounidense, que proclama que la Unión Europea fue creada para fastidiar a Estados Unidos, tampoco parece un garante de la seguridad. Y a medida que las tensiones geopolíticas aumentan, la cuestión de la seguridad energética y la resiliencia de las cadenas de suministro, como vimos en la pandemia, se han convertido en algo central. Y en este sentido hay una reciente competencia, cada vez más marcada incluso con China, por las tecnologías limpias y sin duda por el poderío chino en ser capaz de absorber y buscar y conseguir materiales críticos necesarios para esta descarbonización. Esto está remodelando el panorama económico global. En este contexto, la única vía europea para ganar competitividad, para ganar autonomía, para reducir nuestra dependencia, está claro que es reducir esa dependencia de los combustibles fósiles, porque no los tenemos. En cambio, sí tenemos otros elementos energéticos de potencial, autóctonos, que debemos aprovechar, como son las energías renovables. Singularmente en este país, en España, que yo creo que está muy bien colocado ante una oportunidad histórica que no debemos dejar pasar. Es una oportunidad que se da en muy pocas ocasiones en la historia y creo que España está bien situada y podemos sacar beneficio de esto y liderazgo. Un liderazgo que también pues, haga que nuestro país mejore su competitividad y sea capaz, como lo está haciendo en estos momentos, de atraer más industria. Bien, en esta crisis climática, en este contexto climático, ya antes, después de los acuerdos de París, pero Europa lleva caminando en esa transición energética fundamentalmente con un elemento estratégico que es el Pacto Verde Europeo, presentado en el año 2019 con una ley principal, una columna vertebral que fue la Ley Europea del Clima y luego una serie de paquetes legislativos denominados Fit for 55, que son los que nos llevan a cumplir con esa ley del clima, es decir, reducir nuestras emisiones en 2030 al menos en un 55%. Tras la guerra de Ucrania pusimos en marcha el plan REPowerEU, que era pues cómo reducir, cómo actuar ante esa amenaza que suponía también en el ámbito energético la brutal invasión de Rusia en Ucrania. Y lo que se trata es de fortalecer nuestras inversiones, iniciar una senda que no debe tener vuelta atrás. Hoy en día el Pacto Verde Europeo está discutido fuera por la administración Trump, pero también tiene enemigos dentro. Y yo creo que podemos discutir los ritmos, las velocidades, pero no creo que sea bueno discutir los objetivos, a dónde queremos llegar. Porque aquellos que discuten la senda de descarbonización de la Unión Europea realmente no están trabajando por la integración europea. En el Parlamento salido y en las elecciones europeas del año pasado vimos que hay una nueva geometría europea donde hay fuerzas populistas que en cierta medida también son aliadas, por ejemplo, de la nueva administración americana. Para ellos que zozobre el Pacto Verde Europeo supone también oportunidades para esas políticas que representan. Y nosotros, como europeos, creo que debemos defender nuestros valores y ser conscientes de la amenaza a la que nos enfrentamos. También la política interna, porque en este complicado panorama internacional no nos olvidemos que también hay enemigos de las políticas de la Unión Europea dentro de nuestros países y dentro de la Unión. Recordemos que en 2022 la Unión Europea importaba el 45% del gas de Rusia. Hoy en día es menos de 19-18%, en parte por la aceleración de la transición, más energías renovables, más eficiencia energética, pero también por la diversificación. Y la Unión sigue trabajando para reducir esa dependencia de Rusia y la próxima semana la Comisión presentará sus medidas legislativas para eliminar esa dependencia que queda, el gas que seguimos comprando antes de 2027, en 2027. Una legislación que viene de ese REPowerEU que mencioné antes. Aquí hay que ser cuidadoso y claro que hay que reducir y eliminar nuestras importaciones de Rusia. Un apoyo total a ese phase-out del gas ruso, pero las medidas deben ser coordinadas a nivel europeo y basadas en una evaluación del impacto para asegurarnos que ni un solo euro de más va a parar a Putin. Esto es fundamental a la hora de tomar estas decisiones. En un entorno geopolítico tan volátil, yo creo que la Unión Europea ahora tiene un valor. Es cierto, yo comparto con algunas de las palabras que dijo Charles Powell, de que no tenemos una verdadera unión de la energía, no tenemos un verdadero mercado único con aún muchas barreras internas, incluso no tenemos una unión de capitales, una unión bancaria que sería fundamental para actuar como palanca a la hora de garantizar pues, todas las inversiones en tecnologías de la descarbonización que necesitamos. Pero sí que tenemos una cierta estabilidad regulatoria si nos comparamos con el otro lado del Atlántico. Y yo creo que esto es una ventaja competitiva porque ahora mismo es clave esa seguridad regulatoria, una seguridad regulatoria como un activo estratégico. Muchas de las soluciones que queremos poner en marcha ya están acordadas, solo hay que implementarlas. Va a hacer eso, poco más de un año, y aunque que tuvimos las elecciones europeas, aunque este Parlamento y esta Unión Europea, esta Comisión, quizás está más inclinada hacia la derecha de lo que, por supuesto, a mí me gustaría, pero no podemos volver atrás y volver a confiar en sistemas caducos. Ahora mismo la Unión también está centrada en la implementación de este paquete legislativo que incluye pues, un nuevo diseño del mercado eléctrico, pensado con elementos y herramientas para fomentar la competitividad y el desacople de los precios de la electricidad, de los precios de los combustibles fósiles, vía herramientas como los contratos por diferencia, los contratos bilaterales, los PPAs, y siguiendo claramente lo que dice Draghi, la Unión Europea tiene que acelerar en esta descarbonización para hallar esa competitividad. Destaca entre los elementos que se están trabajando en estos momentos ese Clean Industrial Deal, que digamos que es la pata industrial de ese Pacto Verde Europeo, que quizás no se había manifestado tanto en su origen, y que presentado en febrero por la Comisión, ahora estamos negociando. Quiero decir que en el Parlamento Europeo ya hemos encontrado pues, un consenso entre los principales grupos del Parlamento Europeo para respaldar ese pacto industrial limpio de una manera amplia, y todos los grupos la semana que viene, los grupos principales del Parlamento, vamos a votar a favor. Un plan industrial limpio que se combina con un plan de energía asequible que tienen como objetivo también unos precios más asequibles de la energía, dotado con financiación de hasta 100.000 millones de euros. Fue presentado ya hace unos meses también por la vicepresidenta de la Comisión, vicepresidenta primera, Teresa Rivera, y desde luego para aumentar la demanda en productos y tecnologías limpias, con una apuesta por la electrificación, que es algo que, por ejemplo, lo que vamos muy por detrás de China en estos momentos. Esperemos, China en estos momentos se encuentra en un 30% de electrificación. Europa está aproximadamente en un 23%, con ciertas desigualdades entre los Estados miembros. Y nuestra descarbonización, esa descarbonización que o nos descarbonizamos o nos descarbonizan, desde luego pasa por esa electrificación, aunque no todo es electrificable. Por lo tanto, es importante primero poner ese foco en esa electrificación de lo que podamos, del sector doméstico, del transporte, pero también de esa industria que se puede electrificar, para la que ya hay soluciones, pero que no estamos acompañando suficientemente. Y este pacto industrial limpio debe estar enfocado a ello. También debemos promover flexibilidad en la demanda, el almacenamiento, como se empieza a promover de una manera masiva, y yo creo que todo esto es una oportunidad para tener un sistema más eficiente. Pero como digo, la electrificación siendo clave, esperemos que llegue en esa neutralidad climática 2050 como mucho entre 60 y 65%. Por tanto, queda una buena parte de la economía que descarbonizar sin electrificar. Y aquí es importante, los combustibles son fundamentales, los combustibles renovables como el biometano, los biogases o los e-fuels, los RFNBOs, es decir, nunca me acuerdo de traducirlo, pero bueno, son los combustibles con base eléctrica, es decir, combustibles que parten de los electrones basados normalmente en hidrógeno. Tenemos que proteger nuestra industria europea también a través de mecanismos de esa competencia global y a veces despiadada de grandes productores industriales como es China, que a base de subsidios consigue rebajar el precio de los artículos que nos venden a los europeos, pero que muchas veces vienen con elevada carga de carbono, produciendo una fuga de CO2 hacia otros lugares del planeta, de tal manera que la contribución neta a la reducción de emisiones a veces no es completa. Y ahí queremos que ese mecanismo de ajuste de frontera pueda actuar como un elemento de green shoring, es decir, donde buscamos establecer relaciones más estrechas con aquellos que comparten también nuestros valores. También estamos viendo a veces propuestas discutidas que llevan a simplificar la regulación europea. Yo estoy de acuerdo en simplificar, no tanto en desregular, porque para eso hemos trabajado 5 años regulando y a uno no le gusta ver deshecho lo que hizo con mucho esfuerzo, para ganar esa competitividad por esa vía de la simplificación. Bien, competitividad. ¿Cuál es el reto? La competitividad no puede ser solo pensar en hacer las cosas más baratas o hacerlas a través de subsidios para buscar esa competitividad artificial. El reto es hacerlo de manera justa, antirregresiva. Para ello, por ejemplo, hay un Fondo Social del Clima, que yo creo que es totalmente insuficiente, o los aportes del sistema de emisiones, es decir, el dinero que obtenemos del pago por CO2. Debemos ponerlo todo y utilizarlo como palanca, pero sin olvidarnos que no podemos hacer nada desde lo público sin contar con el apoyo, la colaboración y la confianza del sector privado. La transición está cambiando unos problemas de seguridad por otros, pero con el cambio en algunas cosas ya estamos mejorando. Dice el think tank Ember que cuando los flujos de fósiles se detienen, la economía se detiene. Cuando los flujos de tecnología limpia se detienen, solo el crecimiento está en riesgo. Por lo tanto, este es uno de los retos que tenemos, seguir apostando y buscar palancas para estas tecnologías verdes, que ahora parece que del otro lado del Atlántico quieren abandonar, aunque China siga apostando fuerte por las mismas, que sean un elemento que de verdad nos haga avanzar en términos industriales y de competitividad. ¿Cuál ventaja tenemos en este complejo mundo donde en muchas cuestiones estamos en inferioridad? Pues yo creo que es el mercado único. El mercado único es nuestro principal valor para hacer frente a buena parte de estos desafíos. Y hay que derribar esas barreras que seguimos teniendo y hay que trabajar en esa unión de capitales. Y hay que también convencer a la sociedad europea, y esto creo que es muy importante, de que el camino que estamos andando ni tiene vuelta atrás ni nos conviene detenerlo. Hay que buscar la aceptación pública de la transición. Creo que esto ha sido a veces muy olvidado. Creo que en el desarrollo no solo de proyectos renovables, como vemos en España, sino de algunas otras partes de la transición, que a veces confunden a la ciudadanía, que no sabe si apostar por un coche eléctrico o una bomba de calor para calentar su domicilio, porque ve que los precios de la electricidad son muy inestables. A ellos tenemos que apoyarlos, darles confianza, pero sabiendo también que quien más lo necesita son aquellos que menos tienen. Esta transición no solo debe ser justa, porque hay que hacerla justa, sino porque los más afectados por el cambio climático, pero también potencialmente más afectados por la política de la transición, pueden ser aquellos que menos tienen. Yo creo que los Estados y la Unión Europea deben tener serias políticas de implementación de transiciones justas, no solo en aquellos territorios que se han ido descarbonizando, que es ahí por donde hemos empezado, también en aquellas capas sociales que mayores necesidades tienen. Y aquí nos falta mucho por hacer en la Unión Europea, porque muchos ciudadanos perciben riesgos a sus modos de vida y también perciben riesgos en el futuro de sus hijos y de sus familias y de sus actividades. Veamos si no, pues la agricultura, la ganadería o sectores como el transporte marítimo o la pesca, yo que soy gallego. Por lo tanto, hagamos el esfuerzo de convencer por la vía de una ordenación de la transición, que también creo que está en la directiva de renovables, esa implementación y esa zonificación de áreas renovables para que esta potencia que tenemos, por ejemplo, en España, de sol, de viento y de agua, pues seamos capaces de completarla, pero con toda la gente a bordo. Y luego, por último, dejadme recordar una parte que yo creo que es fundamental en nuestras sociedades europeas cuando hablamos de competitividad, que quizá no está recogida en el informe Letta o Draghi. Un europeo vive de media 7 u 8 años más que un norteamericano. Cuando nosotros nos preguntamos si hablamos de competitividad, siempre nos vamos al plano económico. Pero ¿por qué un europeo vive 7 u 8 años más que un norteamericano? ¿Por qué? Pues probablemente porque tenga asegurada un sistema de salud, porque el aire esté más limpio, gracias a nuestras políticas pues, de transición en las ciudades, porque cuidamos las aguas, porque tenemos unos controles en los alimentos más severos que otros. Por lo tanto, la Unión Europea nos está haciendo también ser más competitivos en nuestras formas de vida. Y esto no lo olvidemos, cuando queramos hablar de competitividad y otros solo hablen de la competitividad económica, tenemos que decir que en la Unión Europea hemos conseguido otra competitividad, que es la competitividad de la vida, por la vía de la esperanza de vida, por la vía de una mejor salud y por la vía también de una forma de vida europea que debemos defender, que a veces parece en riesgo o parece muy discutida, pero solo tenemos que salir a la calle y comprobar que tenemos libertad y seguridad. Y en otros lugares hay seguridad, pero no hay libertad. Y en algunos hay libertad, pero no hay seguridad. Y viendo lo que estamos viendo estos días, por ejemplo, en California, nos tememos que en ese lugar de la libertad empieza a haber menos libertad y la seguridad también empieza a brillar por su ausencia. Por lo tanto, creámonos los europeos que seguimos teniendo elementos de competitividad. Y termino porque se me acaba el tiempo, pero la transición energética también es una oportunidad geopolítica para Europa. Y no olvidemos algo que ha dicho Charles Power antes. Hay gente en ese sur plural que se parece mucho en nuestros modos de vida o en sus valores a la Unión Europea. Concretamente hablo de Latinoamérica, un lugar de grandes recursos que no hay que ir a explotar, sino que hay que colaborar en, digamos, su valorización con los latinoamericanos, donde hay que crear alianzas más estrechas, ayudarles también en su transición, que ellos nos ayuden a nosotros en la nuestra y que busquemos relaciones estables. Yo creo que Mercosur es una oportunidad histórica para Europa, también singularmente para España, en este mundo tan constreñido que tenemos europeos que nos empujan por un lado y por el otro, esos lazos que España mantiene tradicionalmente con Latinoamérica deben ser reforzados para que toda Europa y también toda Latinoamérica se beneficie de esta simbiosis. Yo creo que es uno de los retos fundamentales que debemos abordar en los próximos meses en la Unión Europea y en la Comisión, con fuertes resistencias por parte de algunos países, singularmente como Francia y quizás también Polonia, a la hora de establecer estos acuerdos. Bien, yo no voy a hablar más de China y de Estados Unidos porque hay aquí dos personas especialistas en ello. Sin más, quiero daros las gracias por vuestra atención y esperando que haya un fructífero diálogo a continuación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás. Realmente interesantes reflexiones en este marco que nos movemos tan complejo. Citabas la necesidad de la comunicación y la necesidad de explicar muchas cosas y a la ciudadanía. Bueno, pues modestamente un poco lo que hoy hacemos aquí con Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturi es intentar provocar o promover ese debate serio y riguroso sobre estos temas, ¿no? En un marco, como decías, efectivamente no nos podemos olvidar, en el que estamos en la transición energética. Bueno, pasamos ahora a la siguiente parte de la jornada, donde tenemos la participación de participantes excepcionales, verdaderos expertos en las áreas en las que nos hemos enfocado, Estados Unidos, China y la Unión Europea, en un debate que va a ser, como siempre, como ya es costumbre, como decía María Eugenia, moderado por Gonzalo Escribano, director del programa de Energía y Clima del Real Instituto Elcano. Tengo que decir que hemos acordado entre todos reducir al mínimo sus currículums, porque vamos a darle espacio al debate y porque podríamos estar aquí la hora del debate dando todos sus méritos. So, with this disclaimer in mind, I have the pleasure, I would like to introduce to Samantha Gross. Samantha, she is the director of the Energy Security and Climate Initiative at Brookings Institution, and with, of course, a great knowledge about what's going on in the United States nowadays. Jai Ju, I hope I have pronounced your name. She's researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and she will provide us with her knowledge about China and that area. And finally, Pedro Linares. Pedro, he's a professor in the Department of Industrial Organization of the Universidad Pontificia Comillas and Director of Economics for Energy. He will provide us with a vision of the industry as greatly affected by the issue that we are talking about, or we are dealing today with all of you. Thank you so much for all of you for accepting this invitation. Sí me gustaría clarificar a todos los que están aquí y a todos los que están en sus casas o en su lugar de trabajo que pueden hacer preguntas a través de la plataforma que está habilitada en efecto y aquí a través de las tarjetas que reparten la organización. Thank you very much again, and Gonzalo, Samantha, Joe, Pedro, the floor is yours.
So much to the Naturgy Foundation, and thank you so much, Nicolás, because it was a very impressive presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. And I was beside Samantha, and I thought by Samantha, every time we talk about Trump, it's kind of difficult for our American friends to digest this situation, and especially the very grave events we are seeing these days in California. So, but we are here not to talk about this. We are here to talk about, which role industrial and trade policies may have in this energy transition. How can it support European strategic autonomy, and which kind of tools and policies, accompanying policies, can we implement in order to ease this transition and do it in a fair way, a just way, also to have, a good relation with, diversifying relations and establishing new alliances with other parts of Latin America. Is clear. We at the Elcano Royal Institute has always insisted on that. But there are also other areas in the Mediterranean, and for sure other, as my director Charles Powell said, other developed countries like in Canada, that they are very much in need of European law, I guess. So these are the kind of things that I would like you to ask, to help us, to get a clearer view of which policies and which measure can we adopt. Because in my opinion, at the European Union, we are now at a crossroads, and it's not that clear how are we going to implement such policies. And I'm glad that we are going to have new policies and new measures in the immediate future. But my point here is how can we approach this problem not only from Europe, and we got Pedro for this, as a full professor, he can teach us about this very, very clearly, but also what's the perspective from the United States and how to deal with China. So with this in mind, I would like to pose 3 sets of questions to all of you, and also to try to leave some time, some spare time for and getting some of the feedback from the public or people that are online, because we will really like to do this in a very lively way. So my first question will be a very primary one. Which role may have industrial and trade policies in the emerging rivalry, geopolitical rivalry that my director was mentioning, between China, the US, and the European Union? Is the energy transition at risk because of the fragmentation of value chains and policies? How can we mitigate this fragmentation, or perhaps we should not? So this is a very open question, I know, but I got a more precise one for later. So if you agree, we can start with Samantha, and then we go to GIE, and then we go to the European, enveloping of all these things. So Samantha, please.
Thanks. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. This is actually my first trip to Europe since Trump's inauguration, and certain things are a bit painful, but I'm taking it as best I can. I am very concerned about the degree of polarization and what it means for the energy transition. Reason being that, and this has been very evident in my country even before Trump came back to power, there's a couple of different ways you can approach the energy transition. If you want to do it quickly and at minimum cost, you're using a lot of Chinese products and Chinese materials. China has in many ways cornered or nearly cornered the market on certain materials, particularly certain critical minerals, and not just the mining of those, but the refining of those materials in particular. And so in a lot of places, the value chains are immature or sometimes just don't even exist for certain materials that are crucial to the energy transition. That's great for China. They made tremendous investments, and those investments are paying off. They had an industrial strategy that was looking to the future on this. But now we're all in this position of being somewhat beholden. You saw that in the US IRA that passed back in 2022. It was very focused on revitalizing American manufacturing, creating new value chains in the clean energy space. But the issue is that's going to take time and cost money. And so I'm concerned about this trade-off between cheap and immediate and Chinese versus wanting to have new value chains in the West, however you want to define that today. But that's going to take longer and perhaps cost more money. Just to close my comments on this question, if you look at a couple of the companies that do energy scenarios looking forward, and there are quite a few of them, several of those look at a very bifurcated or divided world. And the thing that they point out is that slows the energy transition. And I think that is the world that I see us headed towards, unfortunately.
GIE, how do you see it regarding China? What can we do? What's your approach on that?
Sure. So thank you also very much for this invitation, and I'm really honored to be on stage with such distinguished fellow panelists and yourself. I think as it relates to industrial policy, one thing that I'm very sometimes keen to stress is the domestic political dimension of what industrial policy is about. Certainly it connects to geoeconomics, of course it connects to the green transition, but sort of the domestic political discussion around the state-society compact, around jobs, around loss of welfare. I think these are fundamental to some of the plans that have been developed, that are being implemented. And not all of these domestic political developments are necessarily in line with the green transition. And I think that's an important factor. I think when we think about sort of onshoring and reshoring of supply chains to include the critical minerals supply chains, I would also stress the quality of jobs, the content of the onshoring, what kind of manufacturing are we bringing back, and the fact that China does dominate in these sectors, that it had an industrial policy around minerals, but other kind of downstream applications. This was part of its developmental trajectory. This is not something that the EU or the US has had to face for a very long time, the prospect it has to have developmental type measures. But again, were these quality jobs? Actually, these were offshored from the EU and the US because these were low quality jobs. We didn't want to be mining here. We didn't want to be polluting our communities, in whether the US or in Europe. So I think the question of not only the political discourse around bringing jobs back, but what kind of jobs are we bringing back? Do they actually contribute to the fundamentals of the broken state society compact, which is being renewed, but it has to be done in ways that are targeted, that are nuanced, that actually do provide growth, that do provide sustainability, that are environmentally productive, and also are not counterproductive to the green transition. So I think these are sort of fundamental questions that we're grappling with now that I think still don't have very clear answers. And I think the more that we can sort of sift through the discourse, get past the politics and take a hard look at the numbers and what is this going to cost us? What is this going to cost the green energy transition? How much is it going to slow the pace? How much is it going to raise the prices? I think that will be the question that I think that analysts will have to grapple with and should be grappling with at this very moment.
Pedro, we land in the European dimension. How do you see this?
I think that Samantha and Jai have raised really important topics, which I'm not going to duplicate. So maybe just to provide a more European perspective, or the way we see the transition is, first I don't see that the energy transition is threatened. It's probably about the rhythm, as Nico was saying before, right? But I do believe that we need an industrial policy, because the way we see the energy transition in Europe is we are already delivering in many aspects, but we're still not delivering, and again, Nicolas said that very clearly, on showing the benefits to society of the energy transition. Of course, there are many, but the way they perceive it is probably not enough to create this strong support for the transition. And there I think that competitiveness and good quality jobs, as you mentioned, are central, right? And this is where industrial policy has a very strong role to play. So if we forget about industrial policy and we only look at energy policy, then we're absolutely missing the points. And when we look at competitiveness, and this is the other point I would like to make, is we tend to think of low energy costs, right? Everybody's talking about the Germans now are thinking about subsidizing their industry. And the question is, of course, this is very important for some energy intensive industries, but those aren't the ones that are generating the wood quality jobs. So should we really focus on energy costs, or should we be focusing more on innovation, on automation, on the real elements that have made China competitive? I mean, China is not competitive just because of low wages. They are competitive because they have automated significantly the production chains, right? So I'm shifting a bit away from energy policy, but I think that discussion is central to all this idea of how well we can do in Europe compared to other regions, and how well can we manage to advance in the energy transition. And the other point I would like to make, which is we're all discussing how this new fragmented world is going to have an influence. If you look at this from the European perspective, maybe a fragmented world is good for us. Because it's going to, if we think about the full liberal multilateral world, that is a much more competitive world. And it is very difficult to create the space for Europe to develop this new industries or these new services that we can bring in. So maybe we could also look at this fragmented world as I know it's a pain for some countries, some regions, but it might be also a good opportunity for us to rethink. And of course, in that sense, and that's my last comment, the key element here, if you want to live and prosper in that fragmented world, you need to be united within Europe. And that's of course a big question that was raised before.
Yeah, very pertinent comments on the significance of innovation. Should we invest more in reducing costs and giving subsidies, or more in innovation? I understand that you tend to think that it's more important to invest more in innovation, and I will tend to agree with you. I will tend to agree with you on that. Okay, if you agree, I don't know if you want to add something to this discussion, or we go for an...
I would love to add a brief comment, and that is, I love your comments about the quality of jobs and the fact that many of these investments that China made were part of its development pathway. Because something, I hate to get too political, but it's unavoidable in this discussion, that is something that I have real challenges with in the Trump administration's policy, is that it seems to be focusing on reshoring jobs that I don't think necessarily Americans want, or that the American economy wants. And in some ways, I read a terrific article in The Atlantic, if anyone reads that here, a while back, about the fact that this policy is almost trying to run development backwards in many ways, and moving away from this innovative economy that we've always been towards a more manufacturing, and not that all manufacturing is sort of simple and easy, but towards more of the basic manufacturing, which is sort of exactly the opposite way that our economy, and Europe's as well, has been trending for all these years. So it really brought up some thoughts that I had read and thought myself in my head about what direction the US is going and what it means for us.
Interesting. I will go now to ask you, which are the prospects for the evolution of both industrial and trade policy related to, energy products and mobility and all that in each big player? I mean, in GIE, how do you see? For sure, everybody thinks, okay, this Chinese strategy of industrial innovation and industrial dominance, if you want, is going to stay here. But do you see any change or any nuance to be made to this prospect, or you just think that the Chinese strategy will be exactly the same? For instance, if they start to get more pain to get into European markets or to react to the very significant tariffs imposed by the US, what could be the Chinese reaction in industrial and trade policy? What will be your conjuncture?
I mean, since nearly more than a decade now, China has been very, very strategic in terms of the sectors it supports and the long-term vision for what sectors of the economy will be competitive in the future. And I think that that's not a question that was happening at the state level, less among EU member states, less among US politicians. And with election cycles and political priorities that have been on a shorter time frame, coupled with the lack of kind of industrial policy type tools in the West. So I do think China's long-term vision around strategic emerging sectors will continue as it has done. They've had in their plans, sort of progressive increases in terms of how much of the Chinese GDP should actually be in these sectors, and they've been meeting those targets quite well. And again, it's across. It's more than just production of goods. It's entire skill sets. It's sort of vertically integrated supply chains. But I think very importantly, it's the skills base. And I think that if we're going to talk about certain sectors that are very much part of the conversation around industrial policy in the US and the EU, just to bring it back again to critical raw materials, the US and the EU are not competitive in these fields, not only because of mines, but it's the entire, again, skills base, everywhere from geological prospecting to processing technology, and the skills and the labor force necessary to make these also cost competitive, not only at home, but also abroad in resource-rich developing countries where research-rich developing countries, including in Central Asia, as was referenced today, they may claim and they may very much want European investment versus Chinese, but at what price point? With what companies? Are those companies ready? Are those companies familiar with, operating in different kinds of markets the way the Chinese are? Can they offer, competitive sort of contracts? And do they even have the skills and expertise actually in this regard? I think one thing that is kind of interesting related to the innovation discussion and also China's developmental trajectory is the strong role that FDI had played in China. In a sense, it was the transfer of European skills and technology to China. And now we're talking about Chinese innovation and Chinese technology. And it's a sort of an open question for me how the EU should approach the possibility of actually sometimes benefiting a little bit from Chinese FDI. But I understand that's also quite a sensitive conversation. And that's why sort of it's interesting to put things in different pots, because when we talk about green transition, it's one thing. When we talk about geoeconomics, it's another. There's another set of policy considerations. And then when we talk about security and security risks, that's yet another pot of concerns. And we've got to somehow balance all three of them at the same time.
I start to get very interesting questions, but I don't know, Pedro, if you want to add something on this.
I think she raised a great point, and we've been thinking about that recently. When you see, for example, for electric vehicles or batteries, Europe has absolutely lost the war. There is no way.
You mean in electric vehicles and batteries, you are combined?
I think we can't forget about it. I mean, it's very difficult to move ahead of China in that regard. So what Europe is doing to a large extent is to bring China in, right? And we have been thinking about exactly that same question, is when China required these foreign investments, they did that under a certain contractual agreement where they had to be shared property, and so that Chinese could learn. And now we have to replicate that model back in Europe. And maybe when we bring battery factories and electric vehicle factories here, we should be doing the other way around. We should be learning from the Chinese and not just allowing all those companies to come in, but also to design it in ways in which we can also profit and learn everything that we have lost along the way, right? So it's quite interesting that we should be kind of assimilating some of the ideas that the Chinese used before.
Great, because you already answered the question of whether the European Union can still compete on solar. So I mean, that was already, I can throw it away. This discussion is interesting because I think there is a division of opinions within Europe. I mean, some people think of the risking, they call it the risking by embracing. That's exactly let's try to do the same that China did with foreign investment. But other people, like for instance from Bruegel, Alicia Herrera and others, they are much more skeptical whether the European Union will be able to do that and whether China will allow us to cut this. And so there is still this discussion, you know. But okay. I'm afraid to ask you what are your prospects for industrial and trade policy from the Trump administration, but I have to do it. I mean,
well, to respond to what you said quickly, this idea of partnering with Chinese companies, I think, is a good one. I mean, China isn't just the world's factory anymore. It's also an engine of innovation in ways that it didn't used to be. But I feel like we in the United States, and before the Trump administration, we're doing a really poor job of that because we have this element of great power competition with China and this fear of Chinese hegemony, which we don't like to think about. So we're viewing China differently than Europe is, and I think in many ways to our detriment. So, for instance, the US has been reluctant to partner with Chinese battery companies for our own electric vehicle industry. Seems a little silly to me, because if you look at the US car manufacturers, they've taken big bets on electric vehicles, and bets that will last a lot longer than a US presidential administration. So, you know, the administrations will swing and these companies will do what they think is right for the future or what they think their future market is. And so I actually think Europe is better positioned to do some of these cooperative things than the United States is, because we're all gummed up in this idea that we're in a great power competition with China. And perhaps we are, but that doesn't mean that we should compete on everything or separate ourselves in every way. The world doesn't work that way. Should I go into trade? And that's a whole nother can of worms, but we can open it if you like.
Yeah, why not?
So an interesting fact to me is that both Trump and Biden have been similar in that they have wanted to revitalize US manufacturing. What they've differed on is pretty much everything else. What manufacturing they'd like to encourage and the tools with which they'd like to use to do that. What the Biden administration did with the IRA looks more like industrial policy, picking industries that we expect to be the beacons of the future and investing in them, and investing in US innovation in those industries, and trying to find the niches in which the US can lead. That looks a bit like what China did years ago, although perhaps, a day late and a dollar short, as we say in the United States. But there's still areas where I think we have the potential to lead. The Trump administration wants to revitalize American manufacturing, but wants to use completely different tools to do so. They really see trade tariffs and exclusionism in America first, and even American dominance in some sectors as the way. And so rather than encouraging the industries of the future, they're focused on excluding products from other countries. I don't see any way where we can tariff our way to an internationally competitive economy. Full stop. Even if that strategy works and we end up onshoring a lot of new manufacturing, which seems unlikely, the end state of that is fat, dumb, and happy protected American industries. This is not where we want to go. And so I'm deeply frustrated with our trade policy. Not just because I think it won't work, because I see it alienating our trade partners, because I see the constant here and there and everywhere of it. I realize our president views that as a negotiation ploy, but it also makes it almost impossible to make investments in my country right now, because businesses don't understand their future costs. Even businesses he claims to support strongly, like fossil fuels. And so that's not the happiest of pictures. But I think it relates back to, we were doing industrial policy for a while, and now we're doing something with the same goals, but with completely different tactics and methods.
Okay. If you agree, we can now move to the EU responses and how do you see it from abroad and from within. I will start with GI. GI, I really recommend you to read a wonderful paper she wrote on the comparison between the risking strategies in the EU and Japan. And I think there's a lot to learn from Japan. And I don't know if you want to share with us, what could be a European Union response in the field of critical minerals? And with that, I also, there is a mortgage and another question. How do you see this, and also this debate about embracing or not, or, and there are also some defense, very, very important defense dimension. For instance, I was reading the other day, a Chinese company has restricted batteries delivery to a drone manufacturer in the US that is the main provider of Ukrainian military. So we are not just talking about, competitiveness and just transition, that for sure they are important, but also about a much more strategic autonomy in defense that is increasingly important for the European Union in the current context. So what can we learn? What would be your advice for the European Union regarding this? Should we embrace? Should we de-risk? Should we decouple? Should we make a combination of them? And what lessons can be learned from the Japan experience that I find is very interesting?
Thank you for the question. I think it is actually a very interesting question because I think when you look at the sort of the geopolitical map or the risk game, I think Japan and the EU are quite similarly positioned as US allies that have been caught somewhat off guard in terms of what the rules-based economic and as well as political order means anymore, and how they should navigate that. I think in terms of direct comparisons, of course, the baseline one that you cannot make with Japan is a single country. So in terms of the tools at its disposal, at the decisions that it can make and the speed at which they can make them, it's of course, I mean, we're not talking about a specific EU member state. We're talking about the supranational entity of the EU, and it's very hard to give direct comparisons and make direct recommendations based on the Japanese experience. I do think that what is very interesting about the Japanese experience is that they've been navigating tricky geoeconomic waters for far longer than the EU has, and far more savvily, and also with elements of not, let's call it the China model, but actually the East Asian model of industrial policy. So they were well equipped, and they are very familiar with these tactics, which again are not unique to China actually, but actually quite unique to East Asian states, developmental states in particular. But as it relates to sort of the geoeconomic picture, I think the Japanese have been concerned as a resource-poor, essentially island country with dependencies, vulnerabilities for a very long time, and not only in relation to China, which of course is its biggest kind of economic player, but actually from far before, with the oil crisis in the 1970s, Japan took a good look at the possibility of supply disruptions and made very strategic decisions that they were not going to, that they were going to cope, that they were going to institute measures to ensure that they were not going to be subject to geoeconomic winds. And I think the EU, having had sat kind of on top of the liberal economic order and having been the establisher of many of these rules, has not been in such a position of geoeconomic and geopolitical vulnerability before, the same way that Japan has. I think what is very instrumental and interesting about the Japanese experience, though, is also how they have been able to, despite being the subject of many of China's economic coercion measures and sort of trade winds that have of politicization, they've navigated a partnership still to this day with China, which is based on a concept of sort of de-risking, sort of de-risking in spirit before the term, sort of came into the policy discourse in 2023. So I think when we talk about Europe's open strategic autonomy, I think Japan has done it quite well. They do it in ways that are de-escalatory often. I think that's the opposite of what the United States does, which is it escalates trade tensions. It escalates, problems. It raises costs, whereas what the Japanese have done is, okay, what is the least de-escalatory thing you can do in terms of economic security? It's diversification. Who does diversification offend? Very few people. China has known that it has to diversify, and it has diversified its suppliers for decades. So this is not a tactic that somehow is counter to WTO, that offends a neighbor. I think there's that diversification of trade and trade partners. There's state facilitation, of course, of trade and export, and this is long-standing things that, of course, Europe is also only now starting to realize how to grapple with, but I think the Japanese case study is very good for Europe, actually, in spirit, if not in the technicalities.
Okay, in Europe we have to learn to navigate in troubled waters. It's a very clear message. If you don't mind, Pedro, I will go back to Samantha to get her view on the European dimension. And by the way, I'm going to recommend another paper by Samantha, a very good one on an American view of the European energy crisis. It's published in Brookings. I really recommend you to read it. What advice will you give to our fellow European officials on how to deal with this administration, and how can we? Is it possible to appease the current administration? Should we go with concessions, or should we go more assertive, as my director and also Nico to some extent suggested.
This is a difficult question. I feel like it requires me to take off my energy geek hat and put on my psychologist's hat. But in all seriousness, there are a couple of things that I think are true and useful to understand about the way the administration operates. The president likes to make a deal. He wants to be viewed as a deal maker. And so at some point, he wants to get to an end state that involves him having a win and making a deal. And so, yes, I wouldn't capitulate to us. Clearly, you need to keep your own interests in mind. But if you can find a way to keep your own interests in mind while giving him a deal or the appearances of a deal, that is an incredibly useful thing to do. And also understand that he tends to come forward with absolute maximalist policies. And you've probably all heard the taco expression that got very popular a couple of weeks ago. And it means Trump always chickens out. But the idea was that Trump necessarily, I think he was offended by it, and I kind of understand why. Because it wasn't that he was chickening out, is that he always intended to back away from that maximalist policy. That wasn't the plan all along. And so I think he was feeling a bit misunderstood. But if you look at this maximalist thing, you have to think about that as a way as him showing up with an American baseball bat to start the negotiations and understand that he doesn't necessarily intend to decapitate you with that bat. What he ultimately wants is a deal. And so that's kind of a balance between not capitulating, but understanding that if you can find some common ground that looks like a deal to him, that is a place where you might be able to find some space for agreement. And again, that's a psychological question rather than an energy markets question. But I think it is, and I also think that he appreciates strength and abhors weakness. And so capitulating is not your friend necessarily.
Okay. Well, Pedro, let me also recommend his blog post and his post that is very, very, very interesting. And he got a wonderful, and also his podcast. I mean, he got a very interesting post on the clean industrial deal. Now that nobody from the Commission or from the European Parliament is present and you can speak freely, what's your view? I mean, I think we tend to share some idea, no? But I let you. What's your position on this, on the clean industrial deal? What can we expect, and what do you miss?
Yeah, I think the clean industrial deal is something that we absolutely need, right? We said before that we need to bring industrial policy, as we like saying, smart industrial policy into the picture, right? So the clean industrial deal is clearly necessary. Now, getting a deal on this type of things among 27 very different states. You mentioned the case of Japan versus the EU, right? That's, I mean, I do empathize with the European legislators and commissioners because it's so difficult, right? So in the end, I think that the clean industrial deal is probably a good idea, but it's going to fall quite short. Let me try to explain it. I think it has great ideas, right? For example, green public procurement is one of the elements that we have been arguing for many years, right? Yeah. Because in that regard, I would also like to introduce another idea, which is that industrial policy is not always about industry. It's about Europe being the second largest market in the world. We have to leverage on that, yeah. Right? So, for example, if we set standards for green public procurement or for any other procurement, or if we set the right performances in terms of carbon emissions or efficiency or whatever, I think we have a clear way to go, right? So I think the clean industrial deal is well headed. Now, which are my concerns? My concerns are, where is the money going to come from, right? And that is a big question, because it seems like, okay, we are going to put a lot of money here, but we're basically taking it away from other places because we are not able to generate more funding, right? So for me, essentially, the problem with the clean industrial deal is, where is the money going to come from? And the second open question about the clean industrial deal is, if one of the largest challenges that we have is creating this innovation that we haven't been able to provide in the last decades, just saying that we're going to be using the same instruments is probably not going to change a lot of things. So probably we need to rethink the way in which we produce innovation in Europe. And we have been working with the Horizon program for many years. We are lucky enough to participate in many Horizon projects. But it seems that we are not able to provide this disruptive innovation that we need. We are not able to generate these new ideas that we need, or we are not focusing on the right topics. So for me, it's not only a question of scale, but it's also a question of how do we redesign our innovation infrastructure. And the Clean Industrial Deal mentions some ideas, but I think it doesn't go all the way. So I think it's a good first step, but we shouldn't expect the Clean Industrial Deal to create this transformation that we need. Maybe we shouldn't just rely on it. Maybe we also need to develop other instruments.
Sure.
This is something that the United States has historically been very good at, and we have a good technical innovation ecosystem, but I think the thing that really sets us apart, and God willing will maintain it, is the way our capital markets work with our innovators. The depth and richness of US capital markets is really helpful in getting new innovations off the ground. Everything from angel investors and venture capital, all the way up the value chain through private equity, and up to perhaps an IPO for a new technology. Soup to nuts, you can go from a good idea to a factory in the United States, and we have the whole ecosystem to make that happen. And so as Europe thinks about how to do this, it's not just the government side, it's also how can you deepen certain parts of your capital markets to allow innovators the ability to go all the way from idea to bench scale to commercial. That's something that we do very well.
May I also add something related? I mean, one of the elements, one of the institutional arrangements that we always mention is, for example, your agencies like Air Paris or something that are able to take risks, right? That is something missing in European policy or in national policies within Europe. We don't think of public institutions are as able to make bets and be able to and possibly lose some of them. That's fine. And also your point about here in Europe we are trying to create this innovation framework from the public side. I don't see that happening. I think you need more to create that on the public side. And let me also say one aspect from the Clean Industrial Deal, which is not exactly in the Clean Industrial Deal, but is very much related, which is the state aid guidelines. This is also one of my concerns about the Clean Industrial Deal framework, which is we already see the tensions between different member states, richer member states versus poorer member states. It's going to be difficult to push this unified framework for industry when different countries have different pockets and different interests. And I think that's also something we need to look at.
I would like to ask you, our director was saying he just came from Kazakhstan. He was very, very happy to be. It's a wonderful place, I have to say. They got very significant resources, not only oil and gas, but also in critical minerals. GIE has also worked a lot on Russia and the Soviet space, and we were talking before. We in the EU, we want to decouple from Russia, but we are still importing a significant amount of critical minerals or minerals in general. I think only the UK has imposed some aluminium, but you will correct me on that, sanctions on this. What is the state of the imports of or dependence of the European Union regarding Russia, and which are the possibilities to diversify in the so-called post-Soviet space? I always thought about, okay, diversifying Russian gas in the Russian backyard was not necessarily a very clever strategic idea, because at the end of the day you are very close to them. The European Union doesn't get that impact on those countries compared with Russia. So how do you see this? Because we talk a lot about the dependence of Russian gas and oil and everything, but very little people speak about dependence in other dimensions, like nuclear fuels, for instance, but also minerals. So what can you tell us regarding the European Union on this?
Yeah, I don't have the exact figures in terms of dependence. I know that for the first 2 years of the war, it wasn't a sector anybody wanted to look at in detail because, there are some things you want to keep a willful blind eye towards. And the minerals, a couple of the mineral categories fell into those camps. I think more measures have been introduced, I think, in the past year or year and a half. I think not only the UK, but I think there's been a stronger look at it. There's been some strange knockoff effects of that, one of which is that China now has cheaper access to ore because they're not being, when they're not supplied to the Europeans. It's made it cheaper and raised costs here, which of course is a general thing that happens with sanctions, including in the oil and gas markets as well. But in terms of the post-Soviet space more generally, I think this is very interesting because it touches on some of the other fundamental part of industrial policy and these new trade measures, which is partnerships, right? And the EU's side of the discussion in terms of how to partner with countries. I don't know that they're doing it very well, but if we look just at the post-Soviet space, one of the poster children for sort of a more diversified landscape for EU critical minerals was Ukraine. Yeah. This was 2021. You signed a critical minerals partnership with Ukraine with the idea that Ukraine also has many of the necessary ingredients for high tech and for green transition on its own territory. What has the EU been undercut by? It's not Chinese investors. It's not, Russian machinations, which of course that's also there. It's actually the United States. And so the United States has, in a sense, carved out a market for itself. I'm not saying that these were viable minerals, of course, and I'm not saying that the EU would have been able to access them quickly, but in terms of the geoeconomic picture of partnerships in general, I think that's the world in which the EU has to now operate in terms of how to do politics. We have resource mercantilism back on the table, and it's not China doing it. I think that's really, really remarkable. As it relates to Central Asia, as I mentioned, is one of those areas where they've done a lot of this strategic hedging for a very long time. They're very good at it. I would suggest not looking only at Japan, but also at Central Asia, because Central Asia has been operating in a multipolar world in its region for decades. And they know how to do it well. And one of the areas in terms of economics is they've been very keen to partner with EU and European countries across their economic space. They much prefer European companies. They much prefer American ones to Chinese ones. But then who ends up being on the ground? And I have to stress again, it's not only that the Chinese are cost competitive or willing to come into sort of more fragile markets or, it's also that the Chinese have the advanced tech. Europe and the United States have lost in the mining sector across the board. So, you can come in with standards, you can come in with great paperwork around environmental assessments and do those feasibility assessments in great ways. But when you don't actually have any sort of capability to put, this is going to be an American term, boots on the ground, I don't think it amounts to very much. So I think there needs to be a wholesale assessment of whether or not these partnership agreements will amount to something. I think that we shouldn't publish, have these memorandums and then sort of never follow up on them and say, we did our job. Now we have great mineral partnerships all across the world now. I think there's a real harder discussion to be had. And I think it would be great, I think, for Central Asia, for Europe, for global markets, if those markets could be tapped, could be explored, could be diversifying the global pool of minerals that we need for the green transition. This is good for everyone. And again, I don't think it's escalatory in any kind of way. So this is good for everyone, but right now, in terms of the tools to make this happen, I see Europe as kind of as missing some of them.
I don't know if you want to add something, but if not, I will go to the remaining questions, and I will read it quite fast, and then you choose which one you like the most. One of them is, I have to translate now in my mind. You have been talking about the relation between China and the European Union. What should be the European Union position? Should it be more cooperative or more assertive? I think to some extent it has already been answered, but if you want to add something on this, I don't want nobody think that I don't read the questions. By the way, if anybody that is at place or online and want to send us any question, I will be happy to read it. Another question is CATL, a Chinese battery manufacturer, is setting a new factory near Zaragoza in Spain. News is 2,000 Chinese workers will be brought to run the factory. I don't know whether this is right or not, but that's the question. I'm just reading. So meeting you with Chinese tech and Chinese labor, it seems to the people who ask this doesn't think this is a real game changer. I don't know if you got any reflection on that. Another question or reflection perhaps, the EU now plans to negotiate the next multilateral framework. The financial, I suppose, what means the multilateral financial framework, with a Commission proposal coming in July 16. What key elements and which strategic investment priorities should the new European Competitiveness Fund bring to support funding to the clean industrial deal? To some extent, it has been also been addressed, but if you want to add something on this. What are the perspectives to create a European market of green hydrogen? We have not speak about hydrogen yet, so that was a very, very good point. In a framework that is, let's say, signed by a geopolitical and geoeconomical framework less and less cooperative. So hydrogen, green hydrogen in a less cooperative framework across Europe. It is really possible to get a common position in Europe, how to manage it. This is a very broad question. I don't know if we got time enough, but still. And finally, that's the final question I got. Can you discuss the prospects, strengths, and weaknesses of clean trade and industrial partnership? That is something that has already been mentioned too, and especially with South Africa. I think this is a very specific question, so perhaps this is my suggestion to the Naturgy Foundation. Perhaps next time we have to talk about Africa in general, because I mean, when we go to the things, I mean, let's a mineral partnership, not only with Ukraine. Hey, the US got one now, a recent one, with Democratic Republic of Congo, replicating the Chinese investment for infrastructure partnership. So I think that perhaps a good thing would be to think in the future, and this is a suggestion for the foundation, perhaps Africa will be important to get them in the picture, and South Africa for sure. So if you don't mind, the guy or lady who asked for this, next year we will get a more significant answer. A lot of questions, 9 minutes, 3 each. You can choose the question you prefer, or you can, while answering at least one of them, add whatever you think it's important for our audience to get in mind. And perhaps with this, again, now we start with Pedro. Pedro.
So I think some of the questions were related to many of the topics we've been discussing, but maybe talk about this factory in Zaragoza or wherever, right? One of the things we start to see in Europe is, and it has to do again with whether we want to reindustrialize or what type of manufacturing we want to bring in. One of the problems people are talking about is that we may not have the qualified workforce that we require in order to run these high-tech factories, right? So maybe one of the things we should be talking about also is how to do this reskilling of workers if we actually want to do that, right? But related to that, the question then are these the type of jobs in which we want to invest? Are these the type of manufacturing sectors we want to invest? Or maybe we would be looking at other sectors that are not already dominated by China. So, for example, Europe is really strong in engineering services. We are really good in chemical industries. So we do have some areas in which we are still, I don't know how long, but we're still good. Why don't we invest in that, right? Rather than bringing in industries or investing in industries in which we may not have this competitive edge, right? So this is an open question, but I think it's a relevant question when we're talking about it. And the other question I guess you're expecting me to address is the green hydrogen thing. And the only thing I would like to say here is that we do work a lot on hydrogen. We have a chair in hydrogen where we're every couple of months updating our estimations. And every time we update our estimates, they go down. Every time we find that hydrogen is going to have less and less and less weights in the energy transition. So, of course, the question is, should we really bet that much into hydrogen, knowing that maybe many of these projects will be abandoned? And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing that many projects don't have off-takers. Because people tend to look at the options, and you find out that in more cases that we might expect, direct electrification is more effective. So, yeah, hydrogen, I remember 10 years ago, we did a study in which we had like a big chunk of the economy, which we call it X, and we said that might be hydrogen or biofuels or whatever. What we find is that chunk is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So betting very strongly on hydrogen, I don't know how robust is that going to be.
Thank you. Gia, anything you would like to answer or to address?
I could just make some general comments. I think a couple years ago, I think when the Green Industrial Deal and the Green Deal it was brought out, there was so much optimism that you could have everything. Just everything, everywhere, all at once, all the time. Everything's beautiful. Yes, exactly. That you could have transition, you could have growth, you could have security, you could have environmental protection, and just beautiful package. And I think at least today we are having a much more nuanced conversation about trade-offs, and I think that's super healthy because you cannot have blanket measures. You need very targeted tools in targeted industries with specific things that are suitable for circumstances as they evolve. And I think that this is what good policy making is not talking about big, beautiful things, which are visionary and necessary, but really the devil being in the detail. I found the Draghi report to be very nuanced. I think it was clear on some of the issues around trade-offs for efficiency and possible kind of slower decarbonization as a result of relying on China less. I would, as somebody who actually works at a security think tank, not an environment or energy one, I just have to make a plug for CIPRI here, and the fact that most of my colleagues, they work on security and defense matters. And one issue that as I was reading the Draghi report, which I read it a lot later than I should have, one area where I didn't think that the trade-offs were discussed enough was the trade-off between green transition and decarbonization and industrial plan and security and defense spending. As you've mentioned, where is the money coming from? And sort of, I remember I noted down in reading it, said digitalize and decarbonize and increase EU's defense capacity. And I'm like, oh wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. Can we do that together? Do these come in line? You can have discussions about greening your military, but I don't know if that works on the battlefield as effectively in the timeframes that you need to. I mean, so I think that this is a question in terms of the trade-offs that I still have. I haven't seen the studies in terms of, you know, how that's going to be handled, but I think it's going to be a very important one in the coming short, medium, long term, maybe even.
Yeah, very important. We are also an international relations think tank, and so for us, defense is very important. Yeah, some people say, okay, there are some opportunities in you know, for instance, you mentioned e-fuels and all that. You know, 60% of the fuel consumption in the military are planes. It's true that this is not a big chunk of the market when you compare with commercial airlines, but still, if all European countries will pull together and try to promote, you know, some procurement on these kind of clean fuels, perhaps it could help to some extent. The same for batteries that are increasingly used in military equipment. You know, now you got drones. Electronics are getting more and more important in defense, and all kind of systems depend a lot on electricity, and there are some opportunities there in order to try to advance European industry in that related to defense. But for sure, greening the military. I mean, many people says that heavy industry will be the last to decarbonize. No. Military industry and defense will be the last sector to decarbonize, because it's not only that they spend a lot, it's also that to build military equipment is very intensive in energy, because there are very, very specific materials that need a lot of energy. So, yeah, I mean, this is a very, very relevant point that we in the international relations and defense space like to highlight. We close with you, Samantha. Any question that you like to address? Any other, you know, point that you would like to raise?
I'd like to tie some of the points we've just heard from the other speakers together around hydrogen. And I'm not at all surprised to hear that your hydrogen forecast keeps declining and declining. And I think the way I'd like to describe that is we can break the laws of man all we want. There are consequences, but you can do it. God's laws, nature's laws, the laws of thermodynamics, they're with us. They're not going anywhere, and they cannot be broken. And with technologies like hydrogen, or I did a seminar yesterday here in Madrid on carbon capture and storage, these technologies cost a lot of energy. And forever and always, they cost a lot of energy. And so we're always looking for the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization technologies that fixes everything, you know, in a reasonable way. And that doesn't really exist. Diversification is the way, looking at the specific process that you're dealing with and how to do that the best. And in many cases, that solution actually isn't hydrogen. You talk about jet fuel, for instance. Jet fuel may be one area where e-fuels make sense, but you have to remember with e-fuels, you're for all intents and purposes running combustion backwards to turn CO2 and hydrogen back into a fuel. And so you only want to do that when you really, really need it. And when you think in terms specifically of green hydrogen, it requires a lot of renewable energy. So you're going to need to produce that in an area where renewable energy is plentiful and cheap. And Spain may be one of those areas. But thinking about an overall European strategy for green hydrogen, it's going to be very regional, because if you don't have the specifics, you take something that's already expensive and energy intensive and make it even more so. So these technologies aren't just specific to specific processes, but they're also regionally specific depending on what resources you have.
Okay.
No one size fits all.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. Okay, we have finished with this panel. Before giving the floor for the closure, I would like to ask you all to thank first the interpreters that have done, I'm sure, a great job. Thank you so much for your job and devotion to this event. Every year we got the same interpreters and they do a fantastic job. But also to our panelists, all of you, very, very enlightening and very thought-provoking interventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting ideas, and we have some ideas for the next year. No? I have two: Africa and perhaps the Central Asia, as you mentioned. Muchas gracias a todos los que han venido aquí a vernos y a escucharnos, y a todos los que están desde online. Desde Fundación Naturi y el Real Instituto Elcano seguiremos impulsando este debate serio y riguroso alrededor de todo lo que está relacionado con la transición energética. Esperamos, estoy seguro que les haya resultado muy interesante, y nos vemos en la próxima ocasión. Muchas gracias.